you all to show up. What do you reckon?
3 minutes early, so we best wait. Wait for people to go on the webcast.
Right then, welcome to the meeting. There don't seem to be anybody in the gallery.
Except the 8 people who were in front of us, unless you meant the public gallery.
That's right. Well, formally open the meeting, then attendance. There's a book going round, and I think that Richard Clark is on a course. Apologies for absence. He's apologised. Declarations of interest. Any declarations, Linda?
I'm not anticipating any on the agenda you have today, Leader, so unless members have got any specific questions. No? Okay.
No? All right, thanks for that. On to item 4 then, which is minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of June. I'll go through those. Page 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All agree those minutes, please show. Thanks very much. On now then to item 5, which is the action sheet. Anything to declare?
No, Leader, unless there's any questions from members, they're there for information.
Any questions? If not, then on to item 6, which is the financial plan, which is Nigel Radius.
Thank you, Leader. This is obviously quite an important and pivotal report as we start the process to. Sorry, can't see you all. I just wrecked the joint. I can't see it if it's too close to me. Obviously, as we start the process to develop a new corporate plan and to develop a medium-term financial plan over the next 3 years, which is sustainable. So if I start with the background, first, and hopefully none of this will be new to members, but it's useful refresher. As part of the budget in March, you approved a medium-term financial plan stroke forecast, and the first 2 paragraphs simply just bring that out and show that over 3 years we've got around £30 million worth of financial challenges. 11.5 of that relates to pay assumptions. We've assumed a 2% pay award, and there's obviously £2 million of increased costs in there as a result of the Chancellor's changes around pension schemes and national insurance. And then there's just over £12 million of assumed Welsh Government reductions. I've assumed minus 4% for each of the 3 years. So of the 30 million challenge, 23, nearly 24 million is just down to those 2 elements. So that's not about anticipating and managing demand differently. Those are 2 elements that we'll have to address simply to stand still. The next part of the report then, I do list out the assumptions. They're just there for information. In 4.3, I then bring out the impact of grant income, and I make the point that we are doing a piece of work to really pull together and analyse all the grant income, what it funds, not just in a service sense, but in an employment sense. And as I said at the members' seminar yesterday, it will be important that we have that information as we consider the budget, because if there are anticipated grant reductions in those areas, we can't just assume that you as members want to take the reductions in those areas. You may want to actually say, well, those services are important to us, and therefore we'll make it harder on the general and hypothecated side. You need to be in that position. Obviously, all of that is reliant on as much information as we can get from Welsh Government as we can in a timely manner. The next part of the report just reminds members that in the last couple of years we have used things such as the collection rate, not doing anything with insurance, defraying borrowing, to sort of make things a little easier. We can't do those this year. We will need to borrow because we're starting to spend money on 21st century schools, therefore we will need to borrow, and we need to do something with insurance, and I put the collection rate up to 99%, which is about as high as it can go. So then the report goes on to the national picture, and I make the point that the biggest single event since the last medium-term financial plan is the election. And as part of my budget report, I did say that we anticipated then that public funding would still be in a place where it would be struggling, and it was just the steepness of the downward curve that would be at play with the election, and everything that's come out since has indicated that the steepness of the curve is going to be quite severe. Obviously, the budget tomorrow will be important. I haven't heard any good news being trailed out of the budget so far. We can only live in hope, I suppose. But they are talking about in-year reductions. I have heard it said around the Welsh Government that they'll cushion that from reserves in 2015-16. But obviously, if their base budget has fallen, then that just makes the challenge for 16-17 more difficult. We know there are going to be further welfare cuts, and the National Health Services is going to be... Oh, sorry. And the National Health Service is likely to be protected, and that will put a squeeze on everything else. And I think at the budget time, I referred to the Office of Budget Responsibility indicating that we're only halfway through, these austerity cuts. Then in 5.2, I do make the point that there's so much uncertainty at a national level, which does make it difficult for the Welsh Government to plan or anticipate and plan properly. But we do continue to push them to have as much information as they've got in terms of what they are planning on. Because we've got to develop a medium-term financial plan, and it does seem odd to me that Welsh Government will regularly say they can't do one because the Chancellor hasn't given them their information. The WLGA believe that the Welsh Government budget is cash flat up to 18-19, depending on what the Chancellor does on Wednesday, and therefore, it's their choices that are really going to make the difference in terms of what we are facing. And I think Welsh local government needs to push hard that funding health at the expense of local government, when local government has social care sitting in it, is perverse. And they need to join those two arguments up, because all the evidence in England is that the pressure on the health services now caused because of some of the squeezes on the social care budget. In 5.3, I've just picked out two charts from the WLGA funding outlook paper, and the one shows the significant real terms reductions for all services since 9-10. The only one in positive territory is social care. And if you think what we thought in 2010-11, those are quite eye-watering numbers that we've had to survive and cushion so far. And the next chart shows the funding gap. If spending continues on its trajectory and funding continues on its trajectory, we're looking at 900 million across Wales. I then go on to comment on the WAO report, which is looking at the financial resilience of local councils, and it's not critical of local councils, it's just recognising those things that we were, or those tools or processes that were fit for purpose in the past may not be fit for purpose as we go forward. And there's a real emphasis on medium-term planning, taking decisions over more than one year. Last part of that section then is about the plethora of new legislation facing us, and I've listed the three most significant ones there. All of them carrying extra burdens, none of them coming with any extra funding. In terms of corporate planning, I make the point at the start that whilst the long-awaited map is now out, I don't think we should look at that to be the silver bullet to solve any of this. Torfaen is probably going to be in existence till at least 2020. Therefore, whilst we must take the opportunities that emerge, and they will emerge, I am sure, we shouldn't look for just a reorganisation to solve this. In terms of planning as well, in 6.2 then we bring out the fact that we need a new corporate plan. The current corporate plan ends at the end of March 2016, which does give the council and you as members and us as officers an opportunity there to renew the corporate plan, recognising the more austere times we're in and the fact that we can't do everything we used to do. And then with a subsequent business plan sitting underneath it in terms of how we are going to deliver on whatever shape the corporate plan looks like, as well as discharging, our statutory responsibilities, which will exist irrespective of the priorities. There's a set of bullet points there, or provocations, later on in that section. What council do we want to be? Do we have too many priorities given the funding envelope? Keeping all things going is probably not sustainable, and there are a range of others there, which I think are important considerations as we get into developing the corporate plan. And the final part of that point is I make the point that we've got a corporate assessment coming up at the end of this financial year in the spring, and there will be a focus on all our planning processes and all our governance processes. So again, we've got a unique opportunity to address those things. Then in terms of financial planning, there's reference in the recent, I've referred to the WAO report earlier on in the report, and I just make the point in this section that as part of, so one of the management assurances I have to give as part of signing off the statement of accounts is that we are still a going concern. I never thought in my working lifetime that local authorities would have to say they are a going concern, but they are going to start looking at our plans for next year and the year beyond to see that we are making the decisions that keeps us financially sustainable. In recognition of the medium-term financial plan forecast that we did in March and the challenging times, we have put in train a number of work streams, and they're listed there in 7.2. Cabinet agreed to appoint a strategic partner, and that appointment was subsequently PwC, and there's another report following on, and they're looking at an operating model assessment and reviewing what we do. We've moved out of County Hall, so we did the big move, but we still occupy a lot of premises, and I think we've got to look at all those premises we occupy and shrink in to the ones that we've got and make even more better use of what we've got rather than look to expand. Looking at fees and charges, procurement, Duncan is leading a review of transportation across the council with a view to setting up an integrated transport unit and really getting to grips with the procurement contracts around transport. Technology and the potential to secure efficiencies, and demand management with a particular focus on universal services. Now, all of those will produce benefits, all of those will be transformatory in part, but they won't solve the whole puzzle. And I did say at the member seminar yesterday that we have got to look to be ruthlessly efficient in everything we do now. And I would argue we've got to start doing things one way rather than several different ways across the council, because all of that will help in terms of protecting as far as we can frontline services. But that won't solve the problem on its own, so therefore I've also asked services for the usual range of cuts and savings over 3 years, so for 16-17, 17-18 and 18-19. Social care to absorb their pressures and up to 2%, all other services absorb their pressures and up to 10%. All of that is excluding schools. Schools have a number of they've got some significant pressures themselves that they have to manage, and as members you haven't given any steer yet on whether you're going to protect schools, whether you're going to look at the 1% uplift for schools. Indeed, the Welsh Government haven't said anything yet in relation to whether they're going to continue the First Minister's manifesto pledge from the last one and actually, still want school budgets protected. Local government will push for as much flexibility and dehypothecation of resources and grants into our settlement as possible. And I think in a meeting with Reg Kilpatrick, that was one of the things that was pushed. The more grants there are in the settlement and the less wrappers that are put around certain parts to be protected, the more chance we've got to make some sense of this. The latter part of the report is just giving the indicative timescales up until Christmas, and some words on the budget guidelines. So it's a fairly sombre report. It's a very difficult set of circumstances. I think the fact that we don't have a corporate plan that goes beyond March 16 does give us an opportunity as a council to recast that in the austere times we're in. And we really must grasp the nettle now as a council and actually plan for the next 2, 3, 4 years and on the medium term and take decisions.
Thank you for that, Nigel. Very good report. Obviously, a lot of work to be done between now and Christmas. And, of course, in the middle of all this, we've got the Assembly elections next year, and who knows what's going to be in the various different manifestos, which could turn a lot of this on its head again. So, a lot of work to be done. Anthony.
Thanks, Leader, and thank you to Nigel for the report. I won't try and replicate the job that Nigel does far better than I could of talking about the challenge in financial terms, maybe add a few more political comments on the situation that we face. This is an important report because I think it kicks off in public maybe the things that we need to think long and hard about over the next 6 to 9 months as we start to plan for the future. That planning has to include an honest assessment of what we can do and how we'll be able to do it moving forward. You've seen the tables that Nigel showed, the chart at 4.2 and also the charts at 5.3, about a £30 million shortfall over 3 years, and that's something that's repeated across local government in Wales and indeed across Britain. That's not something that's unusual to Torfaen, and I think it's important to point that out. What's also not unique to Torfaen is the difficulty for members of the public in understanding that, perhaps. They see their council tax bills being higher than usual, but don't perhaps see that that masks the massive cuts in central government support that we've had. If you think of last year, it was almost £6 million cut in our grant, and the council tax filled less than a quarter of that. So even though people are having to pay more, as councils we're getting less, and that's something that's difficult for people to understand, and it's also difficult for us as councillors to sort of take in and appreciate that despite the fact that we're having to ask people to pay a little more, the massive effect of cuts means that the services are still under threat even before you take into account the growing pressures on them. The challenges are spelt out well for Nigel. I think we need to be realistic and very honest and upfront about what we can do, but I think we also need to be ambitious. I don't think we can use the stark figures that are in front of us to despair. We need to be strategic rather than just reactive, and we need to carve out a vision of what we think local services in Torfaen can look like in a few years' time. As Nigel said, the stark situation that we find ourselves in financially is nothing that any of us would choose, but faced with that, I think we do need to be ambitious and challenging in what we do going forward. A number of appeals, if I can, to finish with. To the UK government, this is the real terms impact of cuts. And I think ahead of the budget tomorrow, which we're all looking forward to about as much as a trip to the dentists, I think that's something that can sometimes be lost in the picture that's given by the Chancellor across Britain on a macroeconomic scale. The impacts on the ground in terms of local services are real, and in terms of maintaining those services and in terms of maintaining our communities, that threat is genuine. So I would ask all parties in the UK government to think of the consequences of cuts at a local level. To the Welsh Government, I'd ask if the threat that faces us is a common one, and we need to work together to address it. And we need to improve understanding between the Welsh Government and local government. We need more freedom for our communities and our councils to respond to the drastic figures that we've seen. We need more certainty, as Nigel said, as soon as possible if we're to plan ahead. You can't expect someone to plan when they've not got the figures to plan from, and I think Nigel explained that well. And that's especially important if you talk about English-style settlements coming forward, as the Public Services Minister did at the WLJ conference. English-style settlements may require English-style freedoms, even if the motives of the Welsh Government for ring-fencing certain areas and for asking for extra spend on certain areas is very genuine and very heartfelt and something that we'd share. There does become a a financial and sort of problem of maths if you go too far down that line. In very much the same way, I'll draw your attention to the points Nigel makes at 5.5. The list of expectations from Welsh Government are genuine and things that we'd aspire to doing, but they have to be viewed in the context of the figures that have just been presented to us. We're not working in an ideal world, and it's unrealistic to expect perhaps more money to be spent on certain areas, as well-intentioned as that is, when the very fabric of our services is under threat. Nigel correctly said that reorganisation won't solve everything. It is in danger of, I think, acting as a bit of a distraction or as an incentive for inertia, and I don't think local government across Wales can afford that. It's also, though, an appeal to everyone here within the council. We need to challenge ourselves, leave no stone unturned to try and find ways of sustaining the services we provide, and remember that the people we serve and the services they rely on should be put first, even if that means thinking things that are unthinkable for us as councillors and as officers. Some of the different operating models across the UK that Nigel touched on are interesting and something that I think we've got to look at in more detail. The Public Services Minister was keen to talk about places like Plymouth. There are examples in the Midlands and the North West of England where a cooperative approach or a different approach to providing services has been looked at. I think the consequences of that are not perhaps quite as benign as they're sometimes sort of explained, but I think it's something we need to look into. The alternative approach that other councils like Barnet have used is even more unthinkable, where basically they've contracted out all their services and they just meet every quarter to dole out contracts to the private sector. I don't think that's something that any of us in this room would look forward to as a sort of a future for local government. But if we don't act, that's the kind of thing that will happen, whether we like it or not. And that's something I think we've got to be strong to try and prevent as people who I think believe in public services and in social justice as councillors. That's why we got into being councillors in the first place. Also, one last thing to finish. I think the staff can be easily overlooked in this and shouldn't be. They've had several years of real terms pay cuts and, in terms of pay freezes. They're being asked to do ever more with fewer people. And I think there's a danger that local government and public services staff, given some of the themes in the media, sometimes get a little bit overwhelmed and depressed. I think we should say loud and clear as a council that we value our staff. Anything that we do to look at the council in the future should value those staff and should appreciate the job they do, because after all it's them that work hard to provide the services that people rely on. So if I can finish on that note and hand back to the leader.
Well done. Excellent financial appraisal. From a political perspective, I couldn't get it better. Anybody else got to make any comments? Lewis?
Certainly support 100% everything Anthony and Nigel has said, particularly about council employees. We were just joking earlier on about the lack of officers, and they are an endangered species under this government. The amount of money that's coming to local authorities is absolutely disgraceful. But, every year we seem to be being hit more and more and more. And this particular year now, when we've got to come up with a new community plan, or corporate plan, or whatever you like to call it, with a decrease in finances. But I think we've got to look seriously at working more productively with the community councils. I've been talking about it now for about 2 years, but really we haven't seemed to got anywhere. But in order to get a new corporate plan up and running, realistically, a realistic corporate plan, then we really need to get the community councils on board at an early stage, and see what help they can give, because we're all in this together, and it certainly needs a lot of work in a very short amount of time. But thanks very much to Nigel for the report.
Thank you, Lou. Anybody else? John?
Just on the comment that Lewis made, we've met with the community council on 3 occasions, and we're making inroads, but not that fast, I'm afraid. Can I just say, Chair, that I think this is the 3rd time now that we've discussed this particular report, so our comments are very well rehearsed on this, I think, and don't get any better every time we present it. I don't get any more comfortable at all. But a lot of people are concerned, I think, on the budget which is coming about tomorrow. A lot of our families that we represent have expressed concerns about how it's going to affect them. And I'm just wondering, Nigel, this budget obviously is going to affect, I would think, some of our devolved services into the Welsh Assembly. I'm just wondering how and when and if, how that will migrate then down to the Welsh Assembly and then down to local government. It will obviously, but when will we know about that? Because it obviously starts with Westminster down to the Welsh Assembly, and then ultimately the effect then will be on us. When will we be told about that?
I mean, the Welsh Government are concerned about they'll have something tomorrow that they'll be able to work on. But then there's talk of a spending review in the autumn, so that will contain further details. And the last I heard was the Assembly were concerned that their budget may be pushed back to the autumn, and we may be looking at Christmas before we have provisional figures. They will be able to determine something from tomorrow in terms of what areas are protected and what areas are not protected. For example, if they protect education or the NHS in England, that will have a Barnett consequential, which will then flow through to the Assembly. But what they may not be able to discern tomorrow is what local government is going to be hit with in England, which also then flows through as a consequential to us. So I think the timings will go back from where they've been previously. But until we know from tomorrow, we can't really ask the Assembly what they think of that and how long they think they're going to take. And he'll probably announce tomorrow the details of the spending review and when that's going to happen and whatever. And that also plays into this.
Thank you, John and Nigel. Dave?
Yeah, question. Earlier on in the piece, I think it was when you were talking about the corporate plan, you referred to we need to do it in one way, as opposed to presumably doing it not in one way. Can you broaden that?
Sorry if I've confused. I wasn't meaning the corporate plan had to be done in one way. I was talking about the wider efficiency agenda then and the efficiencies we're looking for. And I was meaning that processes that we do in the council, as far as possible, we need to be doing it one way across the council rather than in several different ways. I wasn't referring to the development of the corporate plan.
But the question is still relevant because if it is necessary to do it in one way from now on, it implies that we haven't been doing it in one way, and perhaps that's why we haven't been as successful in doing this. What's your comment on that?
Well, I think PwC, when they start to report back, will start to pick up and identify that we do have processes that are perhaps being duplicated across the council, perhaps we're doing things in particular places and not following one standard through. As I say, my point is that if that is true and if that analysis comes up, we need to be bold enough and prepared to say, no, we are going to do it in one way so that we protect as much possible resource for you to invest in the front line as opposed to administration.
Right, thanks for that. Gwenera. Oh, hang on a minute. JB finished?
No, I haven't. That's easier said than done, isn't it? Because the financial pressures that we're undergoing forward over the next 2 or 3 years particularly might very well push us into one particular mode of operating that isn't necessarily what we would want in a more perfect world, because the mood music here is, and I would add my weight to what others have said about the presentation, it's absolutely first class, but when you've heard it 2 or 3 times before, it begins to get incredibly pressurised and not very nice mood music. I also support the general thrust of what Anthony is saying, but just to add a caveat to this, we don't live in a world of ought, we live in a world of is. And the corporate plan too, in my view, isn't fit for purpose, it never has been. And we need to construct a corporate plan that is, and we have to be mindful of the financial constraints as well that underpin our deliberations over this. I have been talking, or we have talked, amongst the Cabinet without officers the urgency with which we need to be looking at developing ideas around this and treating this as a matter of urgency, and I'm sure that that will flow from this meeting, and in the next weeks that's where we will be going. But I think it's important to recognise that there is a limitation placed on what we can do, because the financial restrictions imposed on us mean that the decisions we have to take are going to be narrowly defined as well to correspond with that. And it's one thing to be imaginative and creative, but we haven't got a great deal of resources to be imaginative and creative with, so it's going to be a massive exercise. And at the back of all of this, we have to, because we are Labour councillors, we are representing the Labour Party with certain principles, that we are minded, and we have to be minded that decisions that we take have to be connected with those values that we're here to represent. Otherwise, we are merely extensions of the bureaucracy, extensions of the officers, and that way leads us into peril in a wider sense, without being too obvious. So everything I've heard you this morning, it doesn't shock, it doesn't surprise, because we've heard it before, but it makes me feel no less pessimistic for all that. And I just want to suggest that we don't live in a world of hope, we live in a world of is, and we have to deal with what's here and now. So I wouldn't want anybody to underestimate the size of the problem that we have in front of us.
Right, thank you for that, Dave. I'm sure we don't. Myra.
Yes, thank you, Leader. Going back to 5.5 and the new Welsh language standards, and the point that you just raised, Dave, about the difficulties we've been faced with. And the Welsh language, of course, is important, but it can't be, any changes can't be made at the, when we are taking other services out, services to the elderly or to the young people. I mean, this year is going to be really, really difficult. So I think the priority, well, for me, and I'm sure it is for you, is for our residents. And it can't be about changing the Welsh language or adding improving the standards if that's going to be a cost. And taking the point that Lewis raised about the staff, I think our staff are absolutely first class. They're highly respected, and I mean, they do a difficult job, because whatever our decision is, they have to deal with getting the job done. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of them in all departments, because their job isn't easy either.
Right, thanks for that. Anybody else? If not, you see the recommendations, all agree, show. Thanks for that. Now to item 7, which is operating model assessment. As you know, this comes to the initial one comes to a close in July, is it? And that we're looking here to put some money into continuing it. Richard?
Thank you, Leader. I think you've almost introduced the entire report for me there. In a couple of sentences, I'll try not to add too many more. Cabinet will recall that back in April, you gave approval for us to appoint some external strategic assistants to try and help drive forward some of the changes that the organisation is facing over the coming years. PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, were appointed during the course of May and started the stage 1 of that work, their operating model assessment, early in June. We're expecting that work to conclude mid to third week of July, and the results that we're starting to see come through, and I stress they are early results, look really positive and look like there's going to be some decent opportunities in there for us. So what we want to do is, as that work concludes, be ready to rock with the next stage, so that we can start to identify which of those opportunities will give us the biggest bang for our buck. And to do that, we're looking for Cabinet's endorsement to move on to the stage 2 piece of work, and also to allow us to access the Innovation Reserve to fund that up to a ceiling of 50k.
Right, thanks for that. Any comments on this? Any comments? No? All agreed? Report, Joe. Thanks so much. Thank you, Rich. We're now on to item 8, which is the collaboration and continuing collaboration with Bryan Gwent, in particular over trade and standards. Welcome. Kim.
Good morning. You'll remember I've been here before to seek approval to have a collaboration to improve our trading standards service. That was at a Greater Gwent level. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to progress that model, partly due to financial concerns by some of the partners in that. It does leave me in a position where I have a trading standards department which is really struggling to do anything now other than to react to things coming in rather than provide a proactive service. So we're looking at a very quick, easy fix by having a collaboration with Blaenau Gwent. It's quite a loose collaboration. We're not focusing on all the TUPE transfers and everything. Staff will remain within this authority. But it does give some very clear benefits for us in that we would have cover for staff absences and for capacity to undertake some larger investigations. We can make better use of the expertise of staff and specialist staff knowledge because we'll share it across 2 areas. We're in effect buying in some managerial support rather than appointing a new manager, and cross-warranting staff so they'll work across 2 areas and work into a joint service plan. So we can target resources most effectively and use intelligence-led services across the 2 boroughs. Option 2, to stay as we are, as I said, we're struggling as it is now to develop a good service. We are working purely reactively at the moment, and as Nigel's pointed out, with the financial pressures on us, we are an unprotected department, so things are only going to get worse. So I do think we do have to look at something, and I would ask for your support to take this forward.
Thanks for that. Kim? Well, members will know this has been on the cards for some time. A lot of work has gone on already. I'm going to bring you in in a minute. Don't worry about it. A lot of work has gone on already, and we welcome this update. Now then, Gwennaila.
Thanks, Leader. Trading standards are a small section, but they deliver important services. We have the cold calling, control zones, customer protection, underage sales, weights and measures, and food standards. Unfortunately, the retirement of one of the officers and the sudden death of their manager, Steve Whitehouse, has greatly increased the pressure on the section. They now have very little capacity to carry out proactive work, and they are struggling to cope with the demands of their services. So this collaboration will buy in managerial support and allow us to use the joint resources more effectively to target priorities. And even though the proposed changes are out in the public domain for local government, we still have to get on with the day job. So I would support this recommendation, and thank you for the report, Kim.
Right, well done. Anthony?
Just like to support what Gwennaila has said. I think this shows that both Blaenau Gwent and Torvine aren't sticking our heads in the sand or sort of staying as we are. We're looking to be innovative and to work together and to collaborate where it's going to improve the service, so I welcome that.
Anybody else want to comment? If not, then I'll agree the report, Joe. Thanks very much. Now then, we're on to item 9, which is the disposal of the library building at Lion Street, Glenavon. Victor, over to you, sir.
Back in March, Cabinet received the proposals regarding the relocation of the Glenavon Library from the current building that they occupy to the World Heritage Centre. This will leave a building that is vacant. There isn't a requirement for it by any other council service. So this report is seeking approval for this building to be declared surplus to council requirements and for us to pursue its disposal. Ordinarily, that would be done by putting it on the open market, but in this case, we've been approached by a company operating in the financial services industry that is based in Glenavon, which is also looking for an expansion opportunity. They were going to expand their current premises, but having known of this building becoming potentially available, they've expressed interest in acquiring the building. So we are looking for approval also to enter into exclusive discussions with them regarding the purchase of the building. But if that fails, we'll then put it out on the open market. So 3 recommendations really: to have the building declared surplus to council requirements, secondly, to have authority to enter into exclusive discussions with this company, and if that fails, for us to put it on the open market, and that any other matters pertaining to the disposal that require member approval be delegated to the Deputy Leader as Executive Member for Resources and Governance.
Thanks for that, Victor. Well, this is obviously, I'll bring the people in a minute, this is obviously a very wise move, and we don't want to drag our feet on this, because I understand discussion can continue on through August, and if we can pull this off, obviously it'll mean additional jobs for Navan. Anthony?
Yeah, just to welcome this, something that could, put the building to good use and also provide jobs in Burnavon is something that we should welcome. So I support this report.
Yeah.
I think the importance of disposal of this building now is important because of all the empty buildings in Blenavon, and if this is subject to vandalism, it will be yet another building that will just deteriorate. So I certainly welcome the report, Victor.
Anybody else? If not, all agree with the report, Joe? Thanks so much. Thank you, Victor. Is Sue Evans, and it's a policy choice for care homes. What would you say?
Thank you, members. You'll remember that our policy direction is obviously to keep as many people as independent as possible and for as long as possible in their own home. And you'll know through the frailty programme and other policies that that's what we're able to do in most cases. But for many people, a care home setting is the best place to meet their needs, as they get older, more frailer, and their condition deteriorates. And we have a bit of an anomaly that in the NHS you don't have to always offer a choice because their clinical need predetermines which care home setting is the best place for those individuals. But from a local authority perspective, in terms of social care needs, we have to demonstrate that we've offered people choice, and we would want to do that anyway. Making that decision for a long-term care home placement is a life-changing decision. What we've previously had was a policy that was generated by the previous Torfaen Local Health Board and the Torfaen Council. And then, we were obviously in those co-terminus arrangements previously. So what we've tried to do over the last 2 years is to get consistency across the 5 local authorities and the Health Board to make sure that we're trying to be the same. And, it's to get us used to focusing on regional work and where that adds value. So this policy is trying to update the guidance that we have at the moment to ensure there is compliance. And you can see on page 3 of the policy, that's page 57 in your pack, that there is an element of legislation that we need to ensure that we comply with, and this policy will ensure that we comply with that legislation. If I point out to you the last bullet point on 5.1, so just above that 5.2 there that's up on the screen, one of the things you'll be aware of is that different local authorities pay different fee rates for their care home sector. And, in Torfaen, we're generally, above or at the Wales average. We've done an awful lot of work working with Newport to make sure that our fees for care homes were sustainable. There was no point us trying to make them too low, and we saw in other parts of Wales local authorities being subject to judicial review and also the care home sector becoming unsustainable, which means your care homes close and then you haven't got the capacity. So our fee rates, we think, are at or above our neighbouring authorities' fee rates. The other element to remember is at 5.2, that first bullet point there, is when somebody is discharged from hospital, the first 6 weeks of their care, their package of care at home, to see if they can stay at home is free, so we don't start charging them then. So we do as much as we can, even if somebody's had a long hospital stay, to re-able and rehabilitate and give that 6 weeks free care, and it's usually an enhanced level of support to see if we can avoid a care home setting. The other thing we do, that second bullet point down there, is we try and use, even if they have to go into a residential setting, we use things like our step-up, step-down facilities in extra care or sheltered, or within a care home setting, again, to see if we can rehabilitate them, even if it isn't in their own home, but into an intermediate care level setting. The other highlight there is that one of the best practice elements that people should be doing in the hospital setting is, as soon as somebody comes into hospital and they are frail, elderly, or we think there may be some sort of element of long-term care required, that assessment for a suitable care home should start at the point of entry. And that's one of the areas where we know ward staff don't always do that. So that's something we'll be working on collectively to make sure that we start that planning as soon as possible in the patient journey. So those are the main things I wanted to pick out for you. I didn't intend going through the detailed accommodation policy, but it's just to confirm to you that it will enable us to meet our statutory requirements, consider choice as a factor, and consistently across the 5 local authorities and the health board, so that everybody is operating with one policy rather than 6 that we have at the current moment. And if you're minded to approve the policy, the same policy is going through the health board and the other local authorities in this next month or two. We will all start using this revised policy from the 1st of August. So we're trying to make sure everyone's doing this at the same time. Happy to answer any questions.
Good. Thank you very much for that, Sue. I'm glad to see that all the other local authorities are doing the same thing. You're working closely in conjunction with the Nyland Bevan Trust. Anybody else want to make a comment? Right, no? All agree the report, Joe? Thanks so much. Thank you, Sue. I know you've got another one on you now. The next one is item 11, which is adult social care assisted transport. Sue again.
Thank you. What I'm looking for here is for you to approve the implementation of the assisted transport policy, and then to delegate any future amendments to the policy, because it is an operational policy, to the exec member, so that we don't have to keep bringing it back to Cabinet, because things will change as legislation becomes embedded, and only if there is a significant major change would we want to bring this back to Cabinet. The key messages there highlight what the policy is about. It is to make sure that we have sound eligibility criteria that the Council will use to determine who should be able to access assisted transport, and the policy will ensure that it is consistent across all client types and used in all teams in exactly the same way. And it's for adults who meet our eligible social care needs for care and support, and only funding transport when it's necessary, because we cannot charge for it, so it's part of our efficiency strategy as well. And what we're trying to do with this policy is to get us in the forefront of meeting our new requirements under the new Social Services and Wellbeing Act, which will come into force next year, and also to be in mind of the Future Generations and Wellbeing Act, which focuses on sustainability and looking at what can you do to be prudent in terms of public services. So a group of officers met to have a look at the existing policy and have updated and revised and refreshed the policy to make sure we apply those principles of sustainability, equity, and also, under the new Act, it will be about helping people to help themselves and using that can and can only do test, which means the authority, the public state, should only intervene when somebody hasn't got the means to help themselves. The other thing the policy will do, it will be much clearer on having the assessment for transport as part of the initial assessment whether somebody has care and support needs that they can't meet on their own or through their own community resources. As part of it, under 6.2, we did a lot of evidence in terms of what's happening across England and Wales to make sure that we were in line with the best practice, and this policy will put us at the forefront there of best practice. And what we want to do is, because again, this may mean a change to existing arrangements, we want to have a consultation, and I've set that out for you later on there, and point 7, to just to check with current service users the impact that this, to clarify the new eligibility criteria, Because we previously consulted on a transport policy, this is making the criteria much more explicit and easier to understand for all families and for all teams so that we're consistent. And you'll be aware, as part of our efficiency strategy, we're on an ongoing programme of right-sizing care packages, and an awful lot of transport would have been provided previously to people who, if you reviewed them now, probably wouldn't meet that eligibility criteria. So through that process of right-sizing and promoting independence, it may mean changes to individuals' access to that assisted transport. But we will work on every case, on a case-by-case basis, to make sure we're being fair and equitable. We've got an appeals process in place, so that if families don't like the changes that we're proposing, we'll get another team member to review that case, to make sure there is fairness and equity. But it will make sure that assisted transport is only provided when there is an evidence-based need, and we minimise the cost to the council. And if people have access to their own transport, or they have mobility allowances, we would expect them to use those other arrangements, to reduce the burden, if you like, on our transport funds. And this policy will support the creation of the integrated transport unit that we're working with Duncan and teams to put in place ready from next year as well. So it's in line with that bigger strategic move to make sure we only we use the most efficient method for securing transport. So happy to take any comments with that, and recommend you approve the transport policy for the council.
Thank you, Sue. Any comments on this? Gwennael?
I'm not sure whether this in the report covers what I'm going to say, but I got real concerns because in most of our communities we have lots of groups, like lunch clubs, like hubs, but unless you're able-bodied, you can't get to these places. Now, I can quote what's happening at the lunch club at Gandyfed. We have a number of people that use the bus service, but if the bus is full, and by that I mean the disabled bus, the bus for the disabled, if the bus is full, then there are people left behind, and they can't come because the person can't do a second run. So where in this report is it going to cover things like this? We have old age pensioners that are isolated in their homes, and the whole object of running things in the community is to get people out of isolation and to mix with people. But unless we can access some transport for them to do this, to enable them to do this, Sue, I don't know where we're going to resolve the problem. And I'm sure Lewis can quote many examples of where there is a need for this.
I think the type of service you're talking about there is the service provided by the community transport service. That's separate to this. This is the directly
excuse me, I realise it's separate, but it is an issue that is of grave concern to people out there who still can't access the facilities that are there in the community.
We work closely with community transport, and obviously they are a third sector charitable organisation, so we'll raise funds to increase their capacity. We also promote a number of taxi firms that are able to take wheelchairs and provide good support to people with mobility problems. But the clients we're talking about here are not those who would just go to a social care a luncheon club or other social activity. These are for people who meet our eligibility criteria for care and support and have a social worker, so much higher needs. It wouldn't be just people who have maybe need to walk with a walk-in aid. But we work closely in tandem with community transport to make sure we do what we can to support those arrangements as well. But I'm talking about here people who have quite high needs, who meet our eligibility threshold.
I realise that, but I needed to make the point, and this is the way in.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody understood that. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that this is a separate report, nothing to do with transport in that respect. This is why I didn't declare an interest, because I am chairman of Torvine Communities Transport, and so I just make that clear that this is not a contractual report, is it? It's about a service.
It's about a service. We do contract with agencies to provide this service, but it's different to the community transport SIFLIS.
That's right, because I did speak to Councillor Richard Clark about it, and he said, well, there's no need for you to declare an interest on this. So.
Right, Lewis?
Yeah, but, you know, I entirely accept this is a different thing that Gwynaida was referring to, but she is right. You know, there is a real need somehow to try and tackle the problem that we've got with the elderly, trying to access community facilities. You know, I live in an area, the most deprived area in Torvine, where we managed to buy a bus via Community First. But to actually run, it was only a minibus, but to actually get the resources to run a minibus, you know, because there's all, even though nobody was being paid and people were being encouraged to go in for their licence and all the rest of it, to actually keep that bus on the road was absolutely, you know, the bus is gone now. We had it about 5 years and it filled a real terrific need. But now that bus is gone because we just couldn't sustain it. Things are worse than they were before. So, you know, I don't know what the answer to it is, but there is a desperate need for some more kind of community transport.
Right, any other comment? I take the point when you say this is about people with very high needs. Any other comment? If not, then all agree the report show. Thanks very much for that. Thank you, Sue. And that concludes the meeting.